tous.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel about intermediary bodies. This is the session number 23. To cover this topic, it is my pleasure to have with me four members of the panel. Mrs. Véronique Bédac, Director General of Nexity. Mr. Patrick Martin, who is delegated president of the MEDEF and a CEO of a company, and Mr. Yves Verrier, former Secretary General of Force Ouvrière. He just left his functions. Hello, says he. We will also have via video Mr. Rainer Hoffmann, who is the chairman of the German Trade Union Confederation. Hello, Mr. Hoffmann. Can you hear us? Can you hear? Lovely. I will start with a brief introduction of the topic. What are we talking about? These famous intermediary bodies, you will see that we'll even discuss the definition of these intermediary bodies. They're considered as actors and stakeholders of an organized civil society. They would be representatives of companies, trade unions, associations, political parties, commercial tribunals, consular chambers, organizations of public policies like the Economic, Social, and Environmental Council, or the regional ones, and corporations, youth groups, government organizations, media, etc. So, these intermediary bodies are a kind of relay with civil society, which is absolutely necessary. As the Secretary General of CGT, Laurent Berger, says, the intermediary bodies are there to contest, relay, but when there's a conflict, they're also there to dampen the situation. So, they are an intermediary between the people and the public power. Nevertheless, in a context of social tensions and of successive crises, health crisis, social crisis, economic crisis, political crisis, and of mutation, social transformation, technological evolution, technological transition, there are several questions that you can try to answer this morning. Are these intermediary bodies representative? We're thinking in particular about what we call the social stakeholders or partners. They also have a role to represent the interests of some groups within civil society, and they are to represent them in front of the state. If you look at the Yellow Jacket crisis, we might think that it is due to some weakness of these intermediary bodies. Are they useful? We noted a massive abstention in the last elections. What about the role of the Economic, Social, and Environmental Council? What about its role? And what about the role of the regional ones? And what about public debate? What will be their role in the future? So, the topic I'd like to cover is the representativity of these intermediary bodies. It's often said that the union representation and the union of CEOs are highly representative, are not very representative because of the partial representation. Mr. Verrier, what do you think about that? Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and to this discussion. First of all, as you were saying, and by I mean my organization, Force Ouvrière, we have a different view of what a union is and the role of a union as seen, for example, by the CFDT. I don't feel we belong to an intermediary bodies because I don't think we are a social body that have a role of arbitration because we know what the right solution is. I feel that I represent part of the population. Our members vote for a list that we present, a list of delegates in the companies in particular, and I carry their demand and requests in terms of salary or working conditions. And their demands based on the choices that are made in terms of political and environmental laws, for example. There is an impact on economic activity. There's the nature of jobs. And I make sure we find the right compromise solution with the people we talk to, i.e. representative of companies or the public authorities when you cover topics that that belong to the political sphere. And I represent the members of our syndicate, of our union. Are we sufficiently representative or not enough? I would say that the issue of being representative is really questioned for social partners, in particularly trade unions. Recently, we were told that our rate of representativity was reduced as compared to what it was in the past. Can be 40, 50, 70, but if we look at what the rate of participation in political elections is concerned, it's not that bad. And there are elements that that have an impact there. I'll come back to that, but what I note in your question is that our representativeness is challenged, but you don't question the representation of other organizations or associations, or we are challenged only within unions, and now we are considered and challenged as being the reason for the lack of participation of citizens in political life, and sometimes we're even taxed for being the reason for the lack of participation in the legislative elections. So let me come back to what we represent. An organization such as Force Ouvrière, I gave these figures at our last Congress. We represent 350,000 individual members. And this is the lowest figure because our system is highly decentralized, and we have a number of members that that escape really the formal count. I note that some political parties were very happy to see that they had 120,000 people voting on their platform for their primary elections. When I talk about 350,000 members, they are paying members. They take part in the meetings of the union. And I might add to these 350,000 members the fact that we are in 20,000 locations in this country. Let me finish with one point, because this really enrages me. I just held the Federation's Congress for a week, and there were over 3,000 delegates. And they don't represent themselves. They represent 3, 4, 5 syndicates or unions that for a whole week in Rouen, in a beautiful exhibit place. We were there, and there was not one single report in the main news. So the lack of representativity, I send back this question to those who do not inform us. Thank you. Mr. Martin. We've noted that there's quite a lot of really of division of unions and fragmentation. Why do you think that the political power does not trust these representations now in France? Well, if we look at the union representations, it may be considered as fragmented, but I would say that the political representation is fractured. We have members of MEDEF. It is a spontaneous action. It's an individual one. No one forces a company and its manager to be members and to register with us. We represent companies, and that this represents companies employing 9.5 million wage earners, i.e., half of the private sector in France. And if we look at the figures of Geoffroy Roux de Bézieux, you have 15 new federations that are members of MEDEF. So when we're told that we're not representative, it's factually wrong. Now, the real issue, and I would like I will repeat the words of Yves Verrier. I agree with him. In the collective mind, there's this idea that social partners are old organizations that only represent themselves. It's not true. The social dialogue in this country is as dynamic as it ever was in history. You can measure it through the number of agreements that are signed in companies, in branches, in lines of activities, or the latest professional agreements signed at national level on topics that correspond to the expectations of the workers. Because the real issue is, are we efficient or not? I feel to say that the fact that people are abstaining in the vote is not so much linked to the mode of voting, but to the fact that people feel that the political sphere is not efficient enough. And there's quite a lot of agreements that have been signed on health at work, work from home, vocational training. We're not talking about ethereal issues. We're talking about practical issues. And if in the companies that are members of MEDEF, some have very few members, very few small headcount. Others have a big one. So we have seen the limits of all these exercises. I'm in favor, and MEDEF is in favor of a discussion that would be as rich as possible and between people who are actually responsible and committed and empowered. Thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Hoffman. He's in Berlin, and I would like to ask him something. What about the representativity of trade unions in Germany? Do you note fragmentation which is as important as the one in France? And in what way does the negative collective negotiation system more efficient than in France? Mr. Hoffman.
Very much for inviting me, and it's a pity that I couldn't join you to come to Aix-en-Provence to meet you in person, but I'm glad that via video I can attend the session. So if it comes to trade union representativity in Germany, the situation certainly is slightly different than in France. One of the major differences is that in Germany we have since 1949 a unified trade union organization, that is the umbrella organization, the DGB, the German trade union organization, as an umbrella organization of 8 affiliates. Affiliates from the metal sector, from the chemical sector, the public sector, and so on and so forth. That means the DGB as such, I'm quite glad, have only 8 members, but my 8 affiliates representing in Germany 6 million workers in all different sectors. The truth is that membership also in Germany since decades, unfortunately, is under decline. We came up from 12 million members after reunification, and as I said, nowadays we are representing 6 million individual members. But representativity is not only a question of membership, and I can see here some similarities in comparison to France. I will mention 2 major aspects. We just have finished in May the election for the German Works Councils. That is comparable with the Comité d'entreprise in France. Every 4 years, the members of the Works Councils in 24,000 companies are elected. They are electing 180,000 individual workers' representatives, so works councillors. And the interesting thing is that the participation rate in those elections is extremely high, between 70 and 80%. This is a much higher percentage than in many political elections we have, especially at the local level. And another important aspect for us as trade unions organized under the umbrella of the DGB is that up to 85% of the elected works councillors are belonging to a DGB trade union. So this is certainly another element which is crucial if we talk about representativeness. But nevertheless, the strength of trade unions is depending certainly on membership, and we have significant changes in the labor markets, so that our problem as DGB unions is, are we able to address trade union policies also to the new type of workforce in the world, in the labor world, which is changing rapidly. We have also experienced that workers can have entirely different views, different interests, and how we are able to cover those varieties of different interests, which is a big challenge. The interest for younger people, the interest of people in the in new sectors, in startups. Or do we rightly represent the interests of women into the labor market? So we have learned some lessons over the last decades, and I would say trade unions in Germany are still representative. There are strong intermediate organizations, and they are crucial together with employer organizations in organizing the labor market in Germany. And if I talk about the representativeness of trade unions, I've also to reflect the representativeness of employer organizations, because as a trade unionist, it looks probably a little bit strange if I say that we need strong employer organizations, because only with strong employer organizations we are capable to organize the labor market, to have decent working conditions, decent working times, and so on and so forth. This could be an aspect for another debate because this has also changed over the last decades, and we have just experienced under the circumstances of COVID-19 how we have adapted to new technologies, especially to mobile work and other things, where social partners are challenged every day to address their policies to a changing labor market on the one hand, and on the other hand, guaranteeing good and decent jobs for all or for most of the people in Germany and in Europe.
Merci.
Perhaps
merci beaucoup.
This was enough for the 3 minutes
yes.
I have.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Hoffmann. Alors, Madame Bédag.
Mrs. Bédag, what do you think of the representativity of intermediary bodies? Well, when I came to this conference, I had the idea, we didn't agree earlier about what it represented. I had the idea that intermediary bodies were a must for the democracy. As you know, democracy is not something that is immovable in history, because intermediary bodies obviously create resistance to the central power. It's useful. It's also something that is anchored in reality. It's also something that helps you learn in daily life what democracy is all about. In a union like yours, you're elected, people vote, etc., in the same formative. So my idea is that intermediary bodies are a must if you for the health of democracy. At Nexity, our unions representative. Our unions represented. I looked at the participation in the elections. Usually it's 40%, 30%, and in some it's 50%. And for the presidential elections, we only had 50%. So there is a lack of interest in elections in general. And when I sit in the Works Council of Nexity, I ask myself not about the representativity in terms of figures, but I feel my question is what they're telling me, does that represent the reality in the company? There are things I haven't seen. I'm a manager who actually likes to be in the teams and to see what's working and not working, but I'm not always told what doesn't work. And when you're convinced about something, you can wonder whether they help you organize the strategy of the company. And the answer is clearly yes. We saw it during COVID crisis. We had a crisis group every week with all the union representatives, and we had a great result. I didn't lose anyone on the way. People don't always dare tell you that they're not doing well or things are not well. And this communication with the unions was absolutely essential for us. If I forget figures, if I told, I feel that the unions are really representing the life of the company. The only issue we have, because I have union members that have been in the company for a long time, they know it well and they're present everywhere in the territory. But the problem is who is going to take over. When I see old union members retire, I regret them because they know the company well, they're really committed to the growth of the company, and they have trouble getting new people to join because they feel, okay, is it useful if I'm a member of a union? Will I be set aside? And my worry is more about who's going to take over. Do the youngsters consider these intermediary bodies as useful? I feel they're useful and necessary, but do they want to commit into them? That's a real issue for tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you. Second point I'd like to cover in more details is about social dialogue. We started covering the topic, where does the social dialogue stand? I would like to remind you of something that is important, it seems. Last April 14, there was a national agreement that was signed on parity. And in this agreement, it is asked for the continuous social dialogue leading to a parity economic and social dialogue led by the social partners. But we do have a feeling that over the last few years, the state tried to challenge the union representations by taking over the management of these organizations. So this has led to inflationary tensions that might modify the social dialogue in our country. We can talk about the strike in the railway company this week. So, at Nexity, Mrs. Bedag, can you tell us about how the discussions take place? Have the unions played a role in these discussions? And what about the issue of salary increases in view of the inflation we have now? Have you started the discussion? We have to remember that last December, we were told that we would have rising inflation, that over the first quarter there would be inflation, and then the river would return to its bed thanks to the proper exchange of goods. That was where we were in December. But we, in December, saw right away the increase in the energy bills, and we said we have to support people and help them because this is going to be a real issue. And we added 100 euros to the premium that was given by Mr. Macron. So we added then 200 euros in February. And in our employee participation agreements, as we had quite a good year last year, there was about at least 500 euros for everyone. But our teams were able to get the same savings as the previous years, i.e. 40% of the people get the cash right away, others save it. And now we're going to distribute free shares. So we have a rhythm that really was welcome at the time. I believe we can all say that the inflation we were thinking we would get in December is not what we're getting. It's not the same. It won't last the same. It's going to be even worse in 23. And even in 2022, we might come back to more reasonable figures, but the prices will have gone up. So I believe the actual inflation hasn't really started. It's going to start at the in the fall. This is a discussion we were having earlier. The salary negotiations are now more complicated because of the social dialogue as it is now. Because companies tend to share their added value and protect their development. And we were talking about this with Yves earlier on. He said, but some people, everybody has to get something from it. And I was mentioning the development of the company, and he was saying, well, it's not my problem. So obviously, it's important to find agreements. I find agreements on all topics. We had an employee participation scheme that was negotiated last year, one on disabled people, and it's only the remote, the work from home agreement that we didn't sign because I've considered that I couldn't pay extra for the people who were working from home than to someone who comes to the office. So I believe we really have a good negotiation. Everybody goes along the same way. But when you're talking about salary and wage negotiation, it gets more complicated.
So, Patrick Martin, I turn to you now. If we look at the recently elected parliament, that might have an impact on negotiations. Would it not be a good opportunity to strengthen the role of collective bargaining and labor relations? Well, we'll soon find out, I guess. But what we fear is that we actually had good reasons to be concerned. If we look at our National Assembly, well, there could be a lot of inertia, a lot of hindrance, and that some imperative decisions that need to be made for our country and for our companies may not be made, regardless of what direction decision makers take. Well, we can look at the bright side. Not only during this last term, but even before, there's been so many legislative texts, very verbose, very detailed, and sometimes not consistent. Apologies for being a bit technical, but if you look at the AGEC and the climate and resilience laws, these two bills are contradictory. And then there are decrees for the implementation of the AGEC law that are still pending. So for the population, I guess that must be a bit mind-numbing. And they might have the impression, they might be under the impression that Parliament and government try to legislate on everything, but not necessarily on what really is needed urgently. Secondly, it is a fact that in terms of collective bargaining and labor relations, the employee and employer representatives might have been disregarded, a bit ignored during the last term. And I think that was a mistake because it's a time bomb. You know, our country, there's a lot of discontent in our country. We tend to decentralize decision-making and consultation. I think it's a mistake on the part of the government to want to rule everything in a very top-down manner. That was a really bad mistake to ban the accumulation of two elective mandates because it means that political decision makers are no longer rooted in a local area, no longer in touch. If we look at that landscape, I think employee and employer representatives really want to prove that they can be full-fledged partners in the co-construction of solutions, and they can contribute to a number of situations that might be stalemates, might be solved or unlocked if the government can rely on an agreement between employer representatives and employee representatives. That might make it easier for government to pass laws. That's not to say that we're going to obey the government. It's not to say that employer representatives and employee representatives will agree on everything. On the issue of pensions and retiring age, we'll continue to assume our responsibilities, as we've always done. Mr. Verrier, let me turn to you. What is the room for maneuver of trade unions in France, and do you think that that joint decision-making really works in France? Well, a room for maneuver in terms of collective bargaining does not really rely on the assessment of trade unions. I'll respond to what you said. I'm not saying it's not our business to respond to the situation. You mentioned works councils. What prompted me to object in this shared councils, shared bodies. I'm not here to explain why the expectations of employees might be excessive because of the situation. Poverty is rising. Number of employees who consider themselves to be in poverty has risen. And we're not talking about statistics here. We're talking about people, men and women, and their children who find it hard to find housing, to make ends meet. So if people come to me and say, because of the economic context, I'm no economist, but it still remains true that the situation of employees faced with the surge in petrol prices, inflation, but amongst employees, there's a lot of inequalities as well. That is one of the challenges we have to rise up to. We have to represent people who are in very diverse situations. And I'm thinking of the role of the government. It'd be a good thing if political decision makers assumed their responsibilities, took their responsibilities, which is to really be in the driver's seat, to define economic policies. They actually have bailed out from this. They haven't taken that responsibility, which might explain low turnout at elections. And faced with climate change as well, it seems that political decision makers are actually overwhelmed. And so now political decision makers want to tackle the impact of economic situation by appropriating redistribution of income and social equality. So we find it very difficult in SMEs and small companies. They are in difficult situations. You mentioned yellow vest movements. They are often on part-time jobs. And of course, if you're a single mom, it's not going to be easy for you to go to the trade union meeting. And then when people come to us, they usually are in a real fix. So we find it very difficult to organize a trade representation for these employees. So we're very, it's a far cry from the good old days when in the industry trade unions managed to rally a lot of people around employee representations. You mentioned that in trade unions, so in the 90,000 you mentioned, there's the unilateral decisions of employers. Well, there are 60,000 collective bargaining agreements that are negotiated every year. That's not negligible. If we look at it as an economic mass, this is a lot more than what Yellow Vest movement obtained. And so it's borne fruit. For example, what we've negotiated on the level of contribution, the level of social contributions for employees and for also pensioners, that represents 70 to 80 billion worth of social contributions. Unemployment benefits, that's not something that the government can be free to make cuts on just to make savings. So if the idea of having joint employee-employer representative meetings or bodies is viewed as a way to diffuse the situation, I think that's too simplistic. And, you know, there was this whole bonus and penalty system to try to make it impossible for companies to multiply short-term contracts or fixed-term contracts. Quite recently, I became the Secretary General of Force Ouvrière, so one of the French trade unions. If we could explain today that you know, back in the 50s, when it was trade unions that secured pensions and unemployment benefits, people joined trade unions in very large numbers. So maybe this is what we would need today to rally a lot of people around in trade unions. There's going to be negotiations opened on lost time injuries and incidents in the workplace, so that it be, and we're trying to obtain that compensations in cases of lost time injuries be put directly in a fund, and so that it's not taken away from employees. The government is trying to make cuts to try and make savings because they have debts and unsustainable funds. And there's a lack of training, education, information on what trade unions do, what their added value is. So it is a challenge we need to rise up to. But minimum wage, we consider that minimum wage does not rise enough, bearing in mind the inflation. Well, if it has been raised to its current level, it's a victory that we owe to trade unions. But everybody's forgotten about that, so we think it's automatic, and we no longer consider that it is something we've won and had to fight tooth and nails for. I'll turn to Mr. Hoffman. Thank you for your patience. I wanted to ask you, could you explain how does collective bargaining take place in Germany? How does it work? And would you say that industrial relations are easier in Germany compared to France?
So the first aspect is that the negotiation take place mainly at the sectorial level. That means in the metal sector, the chemical sector, or the public service sector, and so on and so forth. So, and what is important, and Jean-Yves mentioned it, that in our agreements, we are covering much more than the salary. Working conditions, working time, further training. A number of qualitative elements have become over the last years more and more important, especially training, further training, qualification, to keep the employability of the workforce high in order to get decent wages and decent jobs. The problem is, in Germany, that we have been facing also over the last decades a decline in the coverage of collective agreements. In the 90s, we had a coverage of approximately 75% of workers who are covered by a collective agreement reached by employers and trade unions at the sectorial level. After reunification, this decline in the coverage has accelerated, and nowadays, and this is the biggest challenge for us in Germany, nowadays the coverage is approximately 50%. Only every second employee is gaining from collective agreements. And this has a number of reasons. One of the key reasons is that many companies don't join any longer an employer organization, so that they are not covered by an agreement. And even worse, a number of employer organizations give the opportunity to companies to join an employer organization, but not that they will be belonging to collective agreements. So this is one of the reasons why, finally, also in Germany, as it is the case in France since a long time, we had to introduce a minimum wage by legislation and not by collective agreements. But I say also quite clearly in Germany, minimum wage is only the second best solution. The best solution for workers, but also for companies by the end of the day, are decent collective agreements. And we are discussing a number of instruments, how we will be able to increase the coverage of collective agreements. And one of the key factors is, for example, that public procurement should take place only in cases if the company who is offering a certain service is connected to a collective agreement, because if not, the consequence in Germany is that public procurement are financed by taxpayers. In cases those companies are not paying decent salaries based on collective agreements, make a competitive advantage. But the disadvantage for the workers is that by the end of the month, they have to ask for additional social contributions in order that they will be able to have a decent income. And this is be paid by the taxpayers again. And that doesn't make sense for a system what we are calling social market economy. And a final remark I would like to make in this respect, because this is important for France as well as for Germany and many other European countries. Under the French presidency, we have reached an agreement concerning a directive for minimum wages in Europe. The minimum wages in Europe will be different based on the economic strengths, but in this directive, member states of the European Union are urged, in case the coverage of collective bargaining is below 80%, that member states of the European Union should provide action programs how they intend to increase the coverage of collective bargaining again. And I think this is a strong instrument, and we have to watch this quite carefully, because it's not only a problem in Germany that the coverage is approximately 50%, in many other countries it's even below.
Yes.
And this is really one of the biggest challenge for social partners if they are not responsible and if they are not able to cover a majority of the workforce with agreements to guarantee decent jobs, good working conditions, good working times, holidays, and so on and so forth. Then it will be also a question why we need social partners if they are not able to shape the labor market in challenging times. So we have to strengthen the system, and Europe can contribute to this strengthening. This is a point I would like to address as a final remark. Thanks very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Hoffmann.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, we have a few minutes left to tackle the third question, so I'll ask you all to be brief and efficient. So, the third question is the role played by civil society and its impact on actual political decision-making. Ms. Bedag, I'll turn to you. To what extent do you think companies can have an impact on the real world and to really make good on their commitments to the employees? I think companies, private companies and businesses have always had an impact, have always had an impact on people's lives. Regardless of where I go, we always talk about my core business, which is housing. You know, housing is at the heart of people's lives, cost of living, working life, health, and Next City. At Next City, we've always thought we had a role to play. I think maybe it's now asserted more explicitly. Maybe it was more innovative back in 20 years ago. We want to, and our employees want to feel useful as well. They have to be rooted in reality. I think they're losing hope because they cast their ballot and then it seems to them that it has no impact. So they're frustrated. They want to commit and when we provide low-carbon, affordable housing, we fulfill a social role, and we also provide these sort of new form of housing that bring together 10 to 20 housing units that are really affordable. We also have a foundation that is extremely close to young people, so our doors are wide open to secondary school interns. We have opened our doors, and that has led to some really great experience. And we also finance apprenticeship centers. And I think private citizens want to feel useful. They want to be fully engaged. And businesses should make that possible for them. I think it's also a way of increasing our talent retention. And it makes it easier to recruit people, especially young generations that really need to find a sense of purpose. I hope I was efficient enough. Well, yes, indeed. We have very little time. I'll turn to you, Mr. Verrier. Very briefly, please, a quick question on the Economic, Social and Environmental Council. That's supposed to be the third sort of arm of Parliament next to National Assembly and Senate. Does it work? You have a minute and a half. Well, that council should indeed have a great added value, but it's not the case. So it has a very long history, so I couldn't possibly sum it up in a minute and a half. But Léon Jouot, who was the Secretary General of the CGT trade union at the beginning of the century until the 1950s. Back in the 1920s, he was the first to come up with that idea of an economic and social council that was supposed to be counterbalancing, a counterbalance because workers had been sent to the battlefield and time had come for workers to be on an equal footing with private businesses and managers, and should have a say on decisions being made in terms of big industrial orientations. So the point was to make for a forum where this conversation could take place, where there would be a public debate and consultation. So either strike a compromise, pass on these views and opinions to public authorities. Unfortunately, after World War II, that was frowned upon. That Economic and Social Council was frowned upon by General de Gaulle. So he left it standing, but he turned it into a big assembly that was viewed as in competition with the National Assembly and the Senate. And General de Gaulle wanted to merge the Social and Economic Council with the Senate. So we opposed that because we didn't want to become co-legislators, co-lawmakers. We wanted to stay in our roles as union shop stewards. And then what emerged since then is a whole array of think tanks and foundations that look into these questions, issue reports, consult experts. So turning it into a sort of foundation or a big think tank, it's lost its point, its purpose. We'll have to come back to a forum where social, economic, environmental questions are discussed, where there can be free debate, and so that it really can not be a rubber stamping entity, but a real forum for public debate. Well, I'm afraid you'll have very little time, Mr. Martin. There's a multiplication of entities, think tanks, citizens' debates. My question is, does it not bypass the role of civil society organizations? 1 minute. Well, a figure. There's a CEDAP study that was published in January, according to which 82% of French people consider that civil society organizations are not trusted enough and not consulted enough. The multiplication of entities sort of takes away legitimacy from the existing institutions and organizations. So, but there are expectations, there are needs to be met for a more direct form of democracy. So from the perspective of the French Business Confederation, MEDEF, I think we have to make game rules really clear and make sure that everybody abides by these rules. And I'll wrap up with a slightly provocative point. The Climate Convention is a counterexample in the way members were selected, in the way discussions were run, and in the fact that there's a big blind spot, which is impact studies. The whole economic and social dimension was completely disregarded, which resulted in a legislative text that frustrated everybody. It frustrated employee representatives as well as us as a French Business Confederation. So yes, such consultations are needed, but we have to be absolutely clear on the end goal and the terms and conditions. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all. Mr. Hoffman, many thanks from Berlin for taking part in this panel discussion, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye. Bye, Heiner.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. See you soon.